Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Dynamics 365 Accelerate for Customization and Configuration Exam Preparation. Today we are continuing with session number 3. As in with previous sessions, you'll be asked to interact throughout the session using the group chat. I'd like to ask you to please post a smiling face in the chat window now to indicate that the audio is working and that we know you're ready to proceed. Thank you much. If you experience any difficulties during this event, please let me know via chat and I'll contact you one-on-one in order to assist you to solve your problem. As always, it is very important that you remember to keep your microphone muted during today's session to make sure there are no disturbances. To raise any questions, please use the group chat or audio line. And now, without any further delay, I would like to hand over the microphone to your presenter, Ulrich Carlson. Ulrich, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming back here to session 3, where we're going to be looking at managing solutions, working with solutions, and entity and field customizations, and what kind of tools we have to work with, and what kind of settings we have to work with when it comes to generating solutions and working with and creating all these attributes and fields. So, but before we go into too much detail, we'll have a quick review of session 2, where we looked at, first we looked at the hierarchy security position, which essentially can make the Dynamics 365 security model more granular by providing like different kinds of access to record. And there was the position hierarchy and the manager hierarchy that we could work with in order to set that up. Then we looked at, more importantly, we looked at some different ways to work with automation. Background processes or background workflows and how those works, and when you could use the other and the different settings that you have in order to set up those workflows. And of course we looked at the business process flow and the new business process flow editor, where we could basically visually design the business process flow in the different stages and add different workflows to the different stages when necessary, as well as adding global workflows to the business process flow too. I was summing up here, actually calling this in two slides. We're working with the business process flow, also having the conditional branching. And you know, when you guys review the material here afterwards, definitely look up some of the rules around the conditional branching, how you can span a maximum of 5 entities, for example, have a maximum of 30 stages, those different kind of rules. And finally, of course, you can use the security roles to help you define what business process flows each user sees, depending on the security roles that they have been assigned. So you can also use the security roles to determine who uses what flow on what entity. All right, enough about last week's session. Let's get on with the session for today, where we'll be looking at solutions and entity and field customizations. So let's get started with introduction to solutions and what we'll be looking at. So we'll have an overview of what solutions in Dynamics 365 means, and we'll look at the individual components that are part of solution, as well as the solution publisher and versioning of solution, because that's very relevant when you import solution into new environments, or when you import solutions into an environment where you already have a previous version of it. So you want to make sure you keep your versioning under control. We're going to look at the different solution types, manage and unmanage, and when to use the different types of solutions and what the differences are. And we're going to talk a little bit about how do you work with multiple solutions, which is very much often the case, and as well as some features for importing and exporting solutions. All right, so solutions are where you create, package, deploy, and maintain all your Dynamics 365 customizations. So that's where you specify what components that you're working with. And you can use it for organizing those different solutions or those different components, and export the solution file just with references to the components that are involved in this solution and that you have made changes to, so you can import it somewhere else. One of the things the solutions help you with is making sure that you're not working on the entire set of components and entities at once, which would be way too much. So basically also helps you scale down and say, okay, we're going to have a solution where we're just working on a couple of entities. We're just going to bring in the components and work on those, and it'll be a much easier experience. And especially when you have to move it, you're only moving the changes that are relevant instead of the entire solution itself. So only moving the individual with the relevant components definitely keeps your solution file smaller, which definitely when you're both exporting but also when you're importing into a new environment can save you a significant amount of time. If you just imported everything or just worked in the default solution, you could definitely waste a lot of time just waiting for those solution files to import. So keep the components relevant. So what are the different components that we have can work with in solutions? So in the schema, we have the entities themselves. So that would be your account table or your contact table or your case table, depending on what you're working with. Then they have all the fields and attributes that we're working with. So all the fields, all the lookup fields, name fields, annual revenue, account name, address fields, and so on. And then we have the relationships to other entities as well as the option sets in the schema that we can work with. For the user interface, you can have forms, views, charts, dashboards, sitemap, and ribbons all managed individually. For templates, you can include all the email, contract, knowledge base article, and mail merge template. Most relevant are probably the email template and the mail merge template. Contract and KP article templates are being phased out in favor of entitlements and the new knowledge articles and knowledge management system that's available in the Interactive Service Hub. On the processes and all the code steps, you have workflows, dialogues, business process flows, business rules, actions. So basically a lot of the items we talked about yesterday. And when it comes to development and code, that's also where you have your web resources, plugin assemblies, and all the SDK message processing steps. Then there's a miscellaneous other area that doesn't really fit into any of the other boxes. That's where you have all your security roles, your field security roles, all the connection roles. They're included in the solution as well. Reports and the publisher as well as the system settings that are included. So there's a lot of components that goes with working with solution that can all be a part of solution. And when it comes to working with solution and adding all these components to a solution, one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that you're only including references to components in a solution. You don't create a copy of the component in your solution. So it's just a reference to it. So that means that you can have multiple solutions on the same organization with the same component in it, but they will actually not have a copy of the component. They'll just have a reference to the specific entity. So in the example there, we have solution 1 and solution 2. Both contain the contact entity, but they both just contain a reference to the contact entity. So when you export from either solution, that will export all the changes that are included to the components that you have in solution. Doesn't matter where you created it. So anything that you create do on the contact entity in solution 2 will also affect solution 1. And same thing if you do it doesn't necessarily do it in a solution that you created, or just do it in the default solution. Those changes will also appear in your solutions that you have created, assuming that they have the same components in there. All right. So here's this versioning that I was mentioning and why that's important. So Those version numbers that you see, they're being compared when you import solutions. So if you have a newer version and you updated the version number, it'll replace the already existing version of that solution. And the recommended version numbering scheme is a standard major, minor, build, revision format. So you can have something there called like 2.1.12. 0.3, for example, meaning that it's version 2 of the major revisions or major versions, 0.1 because it's a minor version, build number 12, revision number 3, and growing in that order. And that'll be taken into account when you import the solution, and you can actually go back and see in your solution file, if you want to go in and dig a little bit in the solution files, see when new components was introduced to your solution, so you have an idea of how long they've actually been there, if you have a lot of version numbers and then you need to do all digging of where things came from. Solution publishers. One rule about solution publishers is that all solutions must have a publisher. And there's already a default publisher available in the system. It's basically just called default publisher. Or you can create your own. And when you create your own, you can define the prefix that'll be used to name some of the components specifically in the schema name. So you can basically see based on the publisher who's doing the changes or who's creating new components at least for the different requirements that's available. You only have for the prefix, you can't have any more than 8 lowercase letters and numbers. And also keep in mind that if you're working with managed solutions, and we'll get back to the difference between managed and unmanaged solutions, they can only be updated by solutions from the same publisher. And that prefix is not just being used on fields and entity names, for example. It is also being used on values for option sets. At least not the letters that you type in, but the generated code that's being used in there. So we can see that when you put in the prefix, you get an option value prefix generated based on the letters. So when creating a new solution, you can create first up, there's a default solution that already has all the components in the system, which is basically your entire organization. Everything that is available in Dynamics 365 is in the default solution. When you set up the solution, you have some properties you work with. Those are the display name, the name itself, which you cannot change afterwards because it's used for the file name of the exported solution package. And then you have the version number. So all those factors come in, but there are not too many settings on the solution itself. Most of the work is done on the individual components that we're going to be working with. So in creating new solutions, you can both create new components and you can add existing components to the solution, to your new solutions. And here, this is where the prefix is important, because when you create a new component, that prefix that you have on the publisher associated for the solution, that's the prefix that's going to be used on all of your new components. However, any existing components that you're going to add to your new solution will keep the original name. No changes will be made to it. So as soon as a new component has been created, it'll get its prefix. So even if you make it a part of another solution later with a different publisher with a different prefix, it will still have that original prefix that it was given. That will not change. When you do add components to a solution, you're going to be asked about required components and dependent components, and you'll actually have a prompt that will ask you to include all these items that has been created. That is being ignored for system components. And the reason for this is that when you export this and import it into a different organization, all the required components and the components that's assumed are already available in the solution that you or the organization that you're importing to. So if all those components that your solution assumes already in the system, if they're not present in that environment, import will fail. And it will basically just let you know what components is missing. It's not going to give you all of them. It's just going to give the first include all the relevant components in there, like I was talking about, as opposed to basically just automatically everything in order to be sure. So there might be a little work there in getting that done, but I'll show some tricks and how you can see that in the system on what the dependencies are, for example. All right, when you're adding components to a solution, you'll be working with adding the specific entity assets. So you can specify now, and this is one of the newer things that's been coming out here in the later versions of Dynamics CRM. I believe it started with Dynamics CRM 2015, is that you can now specify exactly what components you want included in the solution, not just at an entity level. It used to be just at an entity level, so if you included contact, you would include everything that's on contact. Now you can specify which forms, views, fields, charts, keys, etc. that you want to have include specifically in your solution. So you can actually keep, this way you can keep your solution files even smaller. Just by including the components that are actually necessary and not necessarily all of them. If you have, for example, have a list of 30 views on the account table, and you actually, for the solution that you're creating, you even don't even need to work with views, then just don't include any of the views. They're basically just taking up space when you're transferring solution between organizations. Assets can be added later. That means that you can actually always come back to your solution and add more assets later and make changes to it. Whenever you're doing the initial import of components, that's not set in stone. You can always make modifications to it as needed when you go along. And of course, every time you add an entity, you have to go through this process and specify which assets you want to include. There's an option to say, just check a box and says, add all assets. Does exactly what it says, add all the assets, but for the reason I've just been mentioning and keeping, your solution relevant, I would recommend just basically including the assets that you need. And if you turns out that you need more, you can just come back and add them to it later. It definitely has some benefits as opposed to just adding everything. All right, so managed and unmanaged solutions. I mentioned there were some differences here to work with, and that's also something called the system solution, which is basically the default solution. That already comes with Dynamics 365. The unmanaged solutions, it says here, container for unmanaged customizations. All solutions starts at unmanaged. And when deleted, all components remain in the solution, remain inside the organization. You can't go in and delete those items individually, but an unmanaged solution is basically just a container with references to the components that you're working on for this specific project, or whatever it is that you're working on. So that's another reason that I just keep the components that you're including there relevant. Managed solutions, on the other hand, is something that you install on top of the system solution. you cannot modify those directly, at least. You can probably modify the components in there, but you cannot modify them in the solution. You have to create your own solution and pull in the managed components, and then maybe you can make modifications to it depending on the properties for those components. We'll look at those properties and see how you can manage those settings. Now, what's relevant about managed solution is that when you delete a managed solution, unlike the unmanaged solution, it will also delete all the solution, all the components in the solution at the same time. And there's a note there that it deletes all of those components in the managed solution unless you have other managed solutions that are dependent on them. So that will prohibit you from removing those components. And that actually also means that you can inadvertently create or add multiple managed solutions to an organization and have them be codependent on each other, meaning you can't delete the solution at all because they both require each other. So definitely make sure that when you're working with solutions, unmanaged and managed solution, that you're careful on how your components are handled in order to avoid those codependencies. Managed solutions are not something that you create directly inside Dynamics 365. You create them by creating an unmanaged solution, and then you export that solution, and in the process, in the export process, you mark it as being a managed solution. So when you import it again into a different environment, because you cannot import it into the same environment, but in a different Dynamics 365 organization, it will then be a managed solution inside that organization, where if you delete it, it'll remove all the components and basically remove all the changes, so you can roll back all your changes just by deleting the managed solution. Now, there are also some new features there called about managed patches. Updates and fixes can be pushed out to managed solutions that allow updated specific components and not having to override the entire concept of an existing solution. So there are basically new methods now to create minor patches, updates, hotfixes that if you, and this is particularly for something that's used by ISVs, for example, that do have large managed solution that they push to environment. If they discover some minor bugs that they need to fix, they can basically create a very small managed solution, a patch that they can push to all their customers, and they can import, and they just fix that one component that's included, as opposed to having to re-import a whole new version of the entire ISV solution, which may take a while. So let's look at those different types individually. And we'll start off with the unmanaged solution. And of course, as I mentioned, all Dynamics 365 organizations have a default solution, and that one is unmanaged. You don't really open it up directly in the solution manager, but you can open it up from other views. And of course, unmanaged solutions can be modified. And as I mentioned, all solutions are unmanaged in the beginning, and then later on you can export them as managed, but they all start off as unmanaged. And you can create as many unmanaged solutions as you like in one environment. You can basically just keep on creating them. I don't know what the technical upper limit is, but you can definitely probably create a lot more unmanaged solutions than you're able to properly maintain. So if you remove an unmanaged solution or delete an unmanaged solution, it only removes the container by itself. Keep in mind that all the components, everything that was included, will remain in the system. So you can basically just delete something, and all the components, everything that you've created, will still be in the system. On the other hand, managed solutions, the process for those is that you create them as an unmanaged solution, and then you export them as managed. And during that process, and then when you install the managed solution into another organization, that's when it becomes fully managed solution, and you have control over what kind of modifications can be done to it. So by default, you cannot make modifications to a managed solutions in the managed solutions. You can also not export managed solutions. This is great if you're an ISV, if you're providing solutions to a customer that can, where if they were allowed to, they would have been able to export your managed solutions, and they can basically resell all the systems, for example, all the code. So you cannot export any managed solution. So as long as you control the unmanaged solution, you're the only one who have access to that. And of course, the key difference there is that when you delete or remove a managed solutions, all the items in it will be removed at the same time. All right, so if you're working with multiple solutions, keep in mind that anything that you create is unmanaged and you can modify it, and the solutions contain the references to existing and new components in the default solution. So any changes that's made in one solution, as I mentioned, are also visible in all other solutions in the same organization that contains the same components. That also means more than one customizer can work in their own solution in the same system. So you basically have different people that each work in their own solution, and then they can combine all their efforts later into one solution, just pull in all the same components in there. So let's say we have a question. Once I import a managed solution to a target system, then in target will it become managed, unmanaged? So if you import a managed solution in your target system, in the target it will be managed. So it all depends on how you export it originally. So if you export it as managed, then and you import it into your target solution, it will be a managed solution. If you export it as unmanaged, then it will be unmanaged. So the decision is really made when you export the solution. And when you import it into a new target environment, it depends on the type of solution that you're importing. So you're not making the decision on the import, you're actually making the decision when you export. So good, which brings up a good segue to talk about exporting solutions. And when you export a solution, all the components in it will be compressed, and you'll basically get that in a zip file. And that file name has the solution name plus the version. So that's why the version numbering is relevant too. And inside the zip file, you have all the XML, XAML, .dll images, other files, anything that's included in your solution. And there'll also be a warning if you have any dependent components that are missing. So it'll let you know what those components are, and you should probably include them in your solution if you need them. And only published customizations are exported. So if you have made changes and you did not publish those, they will not be included in the solution on export. So always keep in mind, just do a final publish before you export any customizations on there. The default solution by itself, which basically contains everything in the system, that one can be exported as well, but only as unmanaged. And it's usually a pretty big solution. It's the only time I've actually had to export the default solution with everything in it has been if Microsoft needed to run a support base and do a review on the entire setup. But for moving components, everything, generally that's not something that you would ever do. You would just use your own solution in order to work with that. Now, a little bit about when to use managed versus unmanaged solutions. Is that if you're working in internal development environments, you're working with one customer basically, one end user. Within that organization, that's the end user, and they only have their own development environments, production environment. Generally, best practice is to use unmanaged solutions. It gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of moving components back and forth. It doesn't really have as many drawbacks because you're all within the same organization. You should really have access to all the different bells and whistles that you can do with your solutions. There's really no reason to manage them and narrow down what your options are. Because with managed solutions, they are mainly intended for when you want to distribute customization to multiple different customers and users. So if you're an ISV that basically lives off selling your solutions to different companies and keeping them updated with your solutions, and you sell that same solution to multiple different companies, you of course don't want to do that unmanaged, because that means that they have full access to all your code and everything that's in the solution, and they can make changes to it, and they could basically also resell it themselves if they wanted to. Of course, that would be highly illegal, but that would they would have the option to do so because there's no control of it. You also can't control what people actually do with it, so you would also allow them to make changes and maybe break the system, which you don't want either. Managed solution will allow you to avoid other administrators make changes that will break the system potentially. So that's another reason why ISVs often use managed solutions. But if you're just within one organization, that's all you're working on, then unmanaged is generally regarded as the best practice method. All right, that's a question. Can we export a managed solution as an unmanaged solution? No, you cannot do that. And that's actually for the reasons I just mentioned, because that would allow you to basically buy a solution from an ISV or partner and export it as managed, and you would have basically full access to their intellectual property rights. So you cannot do that. All right, so importing solutions. Enough about exporting. What about importing and getting them into the system? When they're being imported, all the components that are already in the system, they'll be updated with the new information. You know, that could be name changes, any kind of a minor attribute changes to those components. Any new components that are not already in the system, they'll be created in that process. And any dependent components must already be in the target system or be included in the solution. So if they're not included in the solution, they will fail. So if you're working a lot with many solutions and going back and forth, then you'll probably run into that issue that you don't have the dependent items. They're missing, and you will need to go add them to solution in order to properly import them into your solution. If you an unmanaged solution cannot be uninstalled. And the reason for that is that all the changes, component changes that you include in your default solution, all the changes you create in your unmanaged solutions are actually applied in the default solution. So your container will be removed, but all the modifications and everything you did to those items will still remain in the system. So technically, you cannot uninstall an unmanaged solution. You basically just remove the container, and all the pieces are still in the system. However, a managed solution keeps control of its components. The solution can remove, but that will delete all the components in the process. So I got a question here. If you export a default solution, will it include all the managed components? That's actually a great question. I might have to follow up on that. I know it'll include references to it, but I don't think you won't be able to import it into another organization with the managed solution in the version intended. So whenever you do that export of a default solution and you have a lot of managed components in there, it's mostly when Microsoft, for example, you have a support case with them and something's not working and they want to have a look at the complete set of components, they can review it that way. But the default solution, I'm not sure what would actually happen specifically with the managed component in there. But I know it's not a backdoor to getting an unmanaged version of a managed solution. If that answers a part of your question, at least. But it's a good question. I'll actually look into that on exactly how that works, and then I'll sum up on it when we have our call on Wednesday. All right, but let's go into the system and have a look. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, and there you go. All right, so I'll go ahead and sign up by going to Settings and to my Solutions. So what I have here is a new trial. And as most trials do now, it also has field service and project service and some demo solutions all included in here. So it's going to take a minute to load here so we can see all the different services and solutions that are already installed. And we can, of course, see here if they're managed or unmanaged. And we can see that all of these solutions are managed. So if I delete any of these, it will delete all the functionality with it. What I'll do, I'll go ahead and create a new solution up here. I'll basically just click New. And I will create a new solution up here. So we'll just call that Custom Solution 1. There you go. And the name here is what cannot be changed because that will be the schema name of the solution. And I'll select a publisher. Actually, I'll create a publisher. Say look up more records and click New. Notice there I have the default publisher available. That one's always available for all organizations. But I'll create a new one. And I'll just put my name in here. And scroll down a little bit, and let's see here we have the prefix where it says new. So often when you just go into the default solution and start working, create some components, create some new fields, they all start with new underscore, for example. So this is where we can come in and make changes, and I can actually just put in my name here too. Remember that was a maximum of eight characters that could be used, and then it creates an option value prefix that'll be used for this specific publisher. So I can come in and change this if I wanted to something else. I would not recommend doing that. Oh, it does have to be of a certain length. Because these are actually associated. So if I change this to, let's say, then 365, would be the prefix, it changes the option value here to making sure that all those numbers and option set value prefixes are unique in context of the prefix. If you modify the option value prefix, then you could accidentally have duplicate option set values between different publishers. You can, of course, also work that to your advantage if you're interested in doing that. But just keep in mind that that's how it works. And of course, you can add some contact details, phone number, website, etc. If you're an ISV, if you're delivering managed solutions, that's of course relevant because then people can always come in and see where they can get more information about your solution. So I'll go ahead and say save and close to my publisher. And then I'll select myself here, say add. And then I'll put in a version number. I'll just call this version 1. But notice it puts in all the major, minor, build, and revision numbers in there. And I can add another description as needed or more details about this solution specifically. So I'll go ahead and click save. I won't click save and close, but I'll just click save here because I want to stay on the screen. And then I can start adding components to my solution. All right, so it's ready now. And now I can click on Entities. And see, I actually have nothing in here. So I'll go ahead and click on Add Existing, because I want to basically just have some of the entities that are already in the system. And once it's loaded, because since I have project service, field service, and all those other things, there's a lot of entities in Dynamics 365 now in these trials. But I'll just pick the top one, Account. That's probably one of the most used entities, and say OK. And now it's going to ask me about all the entity assets. That's available here, and specifically which components inside the entity that I want to include. And as I mentioned, the fewer I select, I should only select what's relevant, and the fewer I select, the faster the smaller the solution file will get, and the faster it is to import and export. So I'll go ahead and just look here. I have all the different forms that I can select. I have all the different views that I can select, charts, all the different fields, keys, different relationships, messages, business rules, hierarchy settings, and finally dashboards. So let's just say I actually just want to include the main form. I just want to make some changes to the main form, for example, and be able to export those. So I'll select the account main form, and I can also select here whether or not I want to include entity metadata. Now, what that means is all the settings that you have on the entity, if you want those included, whether or not it's enabled for nodes, mail merge, all those items can be included there, so you can automatically enable specific required items when you are importing them into other environments. And of course, there's also the add all assets option there. If I just want to include everything in the entity like I used to do when I selected account, it would include all of these components that we're looking at here, which is actually quite a lot. Now I can specify just which ones I want, but if I want to go back to adding everything, you can definitely do that. But I would recommend only picking what's relevant. I'll say finish, just add the one form. And now I have my account option there, and you can see it under the account and entities. Then I can click on forms. And you can see I just have the one account form. If I click on fields, that'll be empty because I did not include any references to the fields in this solution. And as I mentioned, it's not a one-time thing. You can always come back and select more items. So if I want to come in here, I can select the account entity and say add subcomponents. And come back in here and move, basically add more components as needed. All right, it's taking a second to load there. And I just wanted to show you guys that you can come back and get more items. There we go. So we come in and we can come in and say, oh, we also want to include the account name, address one city field, for example. We want to work with that. We'll say finish, and now we have two components inside the account entity component that we can work with in this specific solution. All right, I'll go back to the slide deck, but creating solutions, adding components, pretty straightforward process. Also, when I say add existing, it doesn't necessarily just have to be one entity at a time. I can come in here and select any number of entities. There's one thing to keep in mind is that of all the entities that I select, I have to go through the entity as a dialog for each individual entity as I do that. All right, well, let me get back to the slide deck here to module 2, which is about additional entity and field customizations. Oh, that was the welcome slide. Sorry about that. All right, here we go. So entity and field customization. So we're going to look at what specifically can we do with the entities. We're going to look at entity ownership, user team or organization owned. What are the differences? We're going to look at the different entity properties, which are some of the entity metadata I just talked about, possibly including in the solution. We're going to talk about the differences between system and custom entities, and we're going to look at fields and get an overview of the different types of fields that we can be working with. So first up, system entities. Those are all the entities that comes out of the box in a fresh Dynamics 365 environment. So account, case, contact, lead, all those classic entities. So those are all system entities. And most of those you can modify to a certain extent. Some you can't modify at all. There are a few in there that you can't. You cannot delete them, and you cannot lock them down with a managed solution, meaning you cannot prohibit others in a target organization to make changes to those entities. Custom entities, on the other hand, is something that we as a system customizer, system administrator can create, and we can either create them directly in the system, or we can also create them through importing a solution which has a number of new entities in it. And we can modify these, delete them as needed, of course, unless they're managed and someone have actually prevented us from deleting these. So those are the ones that we create ourselves. Activity entities are a little bit different from other entities, and because some properties on the activity entity you cannot change. They're predefined by the system. You cannot change them. And that's because all of the different activities has this common activity pointer entity where they share a lot of fields that you can use. So for example, the subject, the start time, the actual end date, actual start time, all those standard activity fields that you see on all the different activity types like task, email, appointment, any custom entities, custom activities that you create have those fields in common on the activity pointer entity, and you cannot really make changes to those. And there are not really any separate security roles or privileges that you can set in order to modify those. If you have access to activities, you have access to all types of activities. Doesn't matter what types. If you create new custom activities, you cannot use the security roles to rule out some specific people from having access to them via the security roles, at least. You can hide those from the activity menus, though, instead of using the security roles to do that. All right. So ownership. When you set up new or create a new entity, you can define the ownership type, which is user or team or organization. And once you save an entity with a specific ownership type, you cannot make changes to it afterwards. So keep that in mind. Once you create your new entity, this setting stays. So the user or team ownership means that the entity is basically going to have an owner field, which can point to either a user or a team. The same way an account, for example, can be owned by a user or a team. The same way a case can be owned by a user or a team. That's the standard way of working with entities. And that's where the security roles gives you 5 different access levels like we looked at last time. We had the organization, business unit, parent-child business unit, user level only, for example. And you can use that field to specify who is responsible for this specific record. So for an account, usually it's the salesperson who is the owner of the account, who is responsible for the account and has to follow up on it. Obviously both for accountability and for security purposes. Now there's another option too, and it's not used as much as the user team. That's the default option. But the organization type of ownership basically means there is no owner field on the record. Nobody owns it. So how does security rules work with that entity? Well, there's only two options. You either have access or you do not. There's no granular control, and there's no specific ownership. So you can use that when people need to have access to all the records of the entity itself. It doesn't really matter the granularity of it. Doesn't matter. It's an either-or situation. You either have access or you do not. So that is an option in there too. One benefit of using organization over user or team is that when you're working with the records, there's less privileges for the system to check for the user who's navigating the system. So there's basically a couple of checks fewer that the system has to run through in order to figure out what records a person has access to, which theoretically should make it a little more lenient and a little bit faster. However, it's minuscule and it's more of a theoretical change unless you do it for a lot of items. I've been in a few situations where something was created as an organization ownership, and then you wanted to introduce user or team ownership later to that same entity, and you just can't do that. You basically have to recreate it. So if you're in doubt, I would recommend going with the user or team unless you have some solid business reasons in order to choose organization, where you do not want an owner field and you definitely only need the two types of access levels. All right. So what are the entity properties that we can work with, or the main ones at least? And of course, when we create a new entity or work with entities, we can specify the name, the singular name, and the plural name. And the plural name is used in default views. For example, it's used in the navigation item. So when you go look at accounts, it says accounts with an S at the end and not account, which is singular. However, the schema name cannot be changed. So even though you can change the display name and the plural name, you cannot make changes to the schema name. An example there is, for example, the case entity. We all refer to as case. We see it as cases in all the views. But the schema name is incident. That was the original name when it was first created, and it cannot be changed. The primary field has to be a text field. And after the entity is saved, that is one of those things that you can modify. However, activity entity properties cannot be changed. So keep that in mind if you're working with custom activities. All right, but there's more properties. There's actually quite a few more. So if you look at the different options for an entity, you see this little screenshot on the side there with all the different things that you could do with an entity, all the different property settings that you can work with. And just a list here that's in communication and collaboration, data services, relationships to Outlook and mobile, relationships to frequently user system entities. Those are just areas there in the entity properties with a number of specific settings under, like enable for feedback, including notes, including activities, connections, mail merge, sending email, etc. And one thing to keep in mind here is that some of these properties, once you enable them, you cannot turn them off. So it's a one-way street. The only way to get rid of some of these items is basically by starting over and creating a new entity. So make sure that when you enable something on here, and it's one of those things that cannot be disabled, be absolutely sure that you do need it. If in doubt, leave it out and just wait until you know for sure that you're going to need it. And I'll give you an example of that, like sending email, for example, will create an additional email field on the entity. If you enable that one, it'll get an email field. Every time you create an email, and you start typing in the name, it'll give recommendations to, in the to field, it'll give recommendation as to who it should send that email to, which is great. It auto suggests who you should send it to. Well, I've seen an example where somebody had enabled this on the case entity. So basically, every time you type in a name or an organization you want to send an email to, it would also suggest all the cases to send an email to that person had already had. So sometimes when you typed in a name, you would get like 25 results, where 24 of them were different cases that you absolutely do not want to send an email to, but they were in there because somebody had enabled that specific entity for email to send emails to. So make sure that you do not check off any of these unless you really mean to. All right, so I've been talking about these earlier, managed properties, and how you can use those to control what people can and cannot do with your components in a managed solution. So they define what you can do with a component after it had imported in a target environment as managed. So basically, how much customization is allowed in your managed solution. And most components do have some managed properties, entities, fields, forms, and those properties you can have settings like, can you change the display name, can you change the properties, can you add forms, charts, views, make modifications, and all out-of-the-box components, managed properties are set to be customized. So keep that in mind. So everything is allowed to be customized by default unless you go in and specifically specify that whoever is going to be working this after it's imported as managed are not allowed to customize these specific items or these specific components. All right, so there's a new option here that's been out in the recent versions. Those are controls and custom controls for field and dataset visualization specifically for the mobile clients. So instead of using the standard fields setup, you could instead on the mobile device display dates, for example, on a calendar. You can use arc and radial knobs in order to set values. So your estimated revenue, for example, on an opportunity, rather than having to type in a number, you would have an arc or knob that the user can basically just take the finger and slide on in order to set the proper value, which is a little easier when you're working on a tablet or phone, for example, than typing in specific numbers. You can have a star rating, the same thing when you like after this class, for example, you'll have to fill out a survey in order to get the slide deck, and you'll be getting a rating on a class from 1 to 5, and hopefully you'll all give it a 5 and say, with 1 through 5 stars, and set that up. So you can include those automatically in your mobile devices. You can do a flip switch for two option sets, where you basically have a yes, no, true. That could be a switch instead. Some different ways for working with number input and option sets. So there's some cool new features in there that you can use to visualize the mobile client and make it easier for users to input the data that's needed. A lot of these are available only on the mobile client. Actually, most of these are available, almost all of them are available only on the mobile client where you can work with this. So you do have to set up the mobile client in order to work with them and try them out. But I definitely recommend doing that. When I say, and of course, when I say almost all of these are available only on the mobile client, it's because there is a new one that just came out. It was really a custom control you can apply to the web client as well, and those are the editable grids. And you define those at the entity level. And you can, under controls, and basically apply the editable grid on the entities where you want to allow users to be able to edit all the information in a grid view. So that's one of the new long-time requested features for Dynamics 365 that have finally become available. All right. A little about the difference between system and custom entities. So the display name and the plural name that comes out of the box, that can be changed. If you do change that, there's a number of entity messages that you should also change. So all the error messages and other messages that includes the account, which we change the account name, for example, that you need to replace as well. And if before you create a custom entity, make sure that there's not already an existing system entity that's intended for the same purpose. And I say that meaning intended for the same person. I know it says on here that if an existing entity can be used. So technically, you could repurpose other entities in the system. If you're working in a service organization and you basically don't work with opportunities, but you might want to use opportunities for something else, which are not opportunity work related, you would probably be better off creating a custom entity rather than repurposing opportunity. Because if you ever get into the situation where you want to use opportunities, then you cannot undo what you've already done. Or you could, but it would be a very, very extensive work. You would probably have been better off just having created a new opportunity from scratch. So before you create custom entities, make sure that there's nothing else that kind of already applies to what it is that you want to be doing. And can successfully use for that. It does require some investigation, but definitely make sure and look at the functionality of the system to see if you can utilize what's already there rather than creating it. Because there are two scenarios that you don't want to run into. That is taking an existing system entity you're using for something that it's not really intended for and then run into issues later, or create a custom entity that's basically redundant compared to one of the system entities. So you can't take advantage of any of the built-in features that are already in system and that might be released in the future that only applies to that specific system entity. So some of those features I'm talking about that applies to specific system entities, like marketing lists, for example. Marketing lists can only contain accounts, contacts, or leads. You can't create a new custom entity and use it for marketing lists. Cases, for example, is a system entity that, unlike every other entity in the system, have 3 different statuses. All of them are active and inactive, whereas a case also have a cancel status. So they can basically be open, closed, and canceled. So they have a 3rd option on there that can be utilized. And there's a question here. I'm sorry if I missed that from earlier, but are editable grids available for all entities? It's available for pretty much all entities. There might be a irrelevant system entity here and there that you cannot enable it for, but all main and custom entities you can apply editable grids to. All right, so custom entities and security roles. So one thing you have to keep in mind whenever you do create a new custom entity, you have to go into the security roles that you're using and go to the custom entities tab and make sure that all your users have the proper privileges, everything that's needed. By default, only the system administrator have access to it. So if you're the system administrator and you create all these new custom entities, then you probably don't notice it when navigating the system yourself, and then you let your other users know and they don't have access to it. So keep in mind that you want to check up on this and go to the custom entities tab in the security roles and make sure that everybody has access to it. And in case any of you guys are wondering about the slides and where you can get a hold of those, normally, if you've been in previous presentations like last year, we would just make them available. But now Microsoft is not allowing us to share them until the class has ended and you have filled out the survey. So yeah, you're unfortunately gonna have to wait until the end of the last session next week, and then you can fill out the survey and you'll get a copy of all the slides. So you definitely will get a copy of all the slides. All right, so deleting entities. First up, you cannot delete system entities. Kind of case closed, not possible. You cannot delete entities in managed solutions, at least not directly. However, you can delete the solution completely and delete all the entities that comes in the solution. However, custom entities that you've created that are in an unmanaged solution, you can definitely delete. However, it cannot have any other dependencies with other items. So you cannot delete an entity if there's a workflow that's depending on it, an active workflow that's running based off of it. All right, so let's go through some of those items that I just talked about. Let me go ahead and share my desktop. All right, so here I am. I'm still having my custom solution one open. And I'll go ahead and create a new entity. So instead of clicking add existing, I'll click new. And I'll basically call this one custom entity. And plural name, that'll be custom entities. And I'll leave this as user team the default option. And I could also specify a color in the menu scheme if I wanted that. And check off any of the different areas where I wanted this to be included. So if I wanted this in the sales tab, basically just check off this box and then it'll be available under the sales tab. I can also enable it for the interactive experience, enable it for business process flow, enable it for feedback, notes, activities, connections, sending email, mail merge. I'll take mail merge off. Notice most of these, except mail merge, are actually disabled by default, so you can't really add any of them by accident, but that is possible. So all the ones that I mentioned that you cannot disable, notice some of these have this little plus sign after it. Those are the ones that you cannot disable afterwards, like sending email, have this little sign there. So those you cannot disable afterwards. And of course, finally, you have the Outlook and mobile, enable for mobile phone, whether or not it should be read-only, etc. So I'll go ahead and click Save. And it'll now create the entity and create like all the main fields and a main form to work with. All right, so this is just taking a second. So it's creating all the fields that are necessary in order to create the entity. So the primary field, the name field, the owner field, all the fields that's necessary, as well as a relationship to system user and team, for example, because of the owner field, because this is a user team area. And then it'll also create a form and some very basic views that so you can start working with and start making modifications to. All right, so this is taking a little longer than usual. All right, there we go. All right, so now it's been created. And as I mentioned, we can go review the fields, see all the fields that have been created. You guys get 19 fields out of the box. We can go see the different relationship that it creates automatically to all the system entities. Go look at the different forms that it makes available. And we can click on, basically just select one of the forms here and go into more actions and look at the manage properties. So here from the manage properties is where we can select what you can do or not do with the form, for example, and say, is this customizable? Yes, no. Can it be deleted? True, false, for example, and make changes to that as needed. The same thing you can do with the fields, in the individual fields, and manage all the properties. So notice here on the fields we have some more options. Display name can be modified, change requirement level, change additional properties. You can make all kinds of modifications on this too. I'll say cancel to this and close out of my custom entity. And then I'll go ahead and say export solution. And I'll actually just remind me here that I should probably publish everything. I'm not going to do that at this time. I'll just click next, even though I know I haven't published it, but I'm not going to go through the whole process. The export system settings here, this one I actually just won't talk to. This is not really as relevant any longer as it's been in previous versions. What is relevant though is here when you get to the page with package type, you have unmanaged and managed solutions. So this is actually where you specify whether or not your solution will be managed or unmanaged. All right, I'm getting one comment that one person can't see my screen. Hopefully most of you can see it. But I'll definitely try and reshare the screen here in a second. So we can go through all those. Select the managed or unmanaged items there. So I'll cancel this because I actually don't want to go through the whole process of exporting a managed solution. And notice here I can come back to information, and that's where I have all the information that I entered earlier. But let me go to accounts and have a look at the account settings and the account properties. And we can see the additional items here. So we have general, primary field, and controls. And this is where we can actually come in and say add controls. And one of those controls that we can add is the editable grid. So I can include that here and say add and specify on which clients I want to make this editable grid available. And I'm just going to make this available throughout. And notice here I can also specify some of the grid views. I can say add lookup and specify some of these views. For example, my active accounts. There's a primary contact lookup. And I can specify here that it should only show records where that contact is related to the to this specific company. So you can only, for the primary contact, you can actually only add contacts that are associated with that company. The same way that the filter applies on the account itself. You can specify whether or not users can turn off this filter. I'll go ahead and say OK. And this time I'll actually say publish. And I won't, because I have to make sure I save all the changes first, and then I can publish. So the nested grid view, there's a question on that. That's actually not a part of the presentation, but I can definitely talk to it. It is the, for the mobile client, it doesn't work on the web client, but on the mobile client, you can have a nested grid view. So you under, for example, the account, you can also have a nested view of contacts where you can edit information on there. So you can have basically nested views, a nested grid, so you can do basically multiple modifications in one go, instead of just using it on just one entity at a time. All right, so we got this published. So let's go back here and have a look. And I'll just go back to my dashboard and make sure my browser is properly refreshed. Sometimes this does take a few minutes in order for the editable grid view to work. So hopefully it got properly refreshed here on the first go. So I'll go to accounts. All right. All right, so it hasn't added my editable grid option yet, unfortunately. I'm gonna do a quick publish and let it sink in, and then I'll show you guys the result here on the next demo. We don't have to sit and wait for a publish to happen on while you guys are waiting for it. So I'll get on with the content, and then I'll just revisit that quickly later. All right, so because next up we have fields, and fields is basically stores a single value of a defined data type. And sometimes you can format these in different manners. So text fields, for example, can be formatted as URLs, for example. And they appear as a control on a form, or can appear as a control on a form. Also used in the views. You can use them for querying, for filtering purposes, and that's basically the data that's stored in a column in a SQL table. If you're a developer, you probably refer to them as attributes. I've been working with specifically with Dynamics 365 a long time. You might be referring to it as attributes as well, as that's what they are mainly referred to. There are 3 different types of fields that you can work with. There's the simple field, which is basically where you just input data, depending on what type it is, but you input data, the user inputs data, or workflow puts in data. Then there's a calculated field where you cannot input data, but there's a calculation automatically in the field that picks up information from this record or parent records and works with the data and aggregates it, do some kind of calculation, concatenation of different other fields, for example, and that all happens automatically. That's a calculated field. Then there's the roll-up field, which basically looks at all the child records of a specific type and counts them based on specific criteria, or can do like average, minimum, or maximum values from the child records. So that's a roll-up field because it's rolling up information from the child records. So different field and data types that you have access to. So that's and this list is primarily just for reference. I'm not going to necessarily go through all of it. That's a single line of text, maximum 4,000 characters. You have option sets, 2 options. Image, whole number, decimal numbers, etc. Multiple lines of text can hold up to 100,000 characters, which is sufficient for most things. And of course, there's lookup fields and customer fields. The one thing that's a little different from the other fields, lookup fields look up one specific entity. So if you're on a contact and look up the parent account, it looks up to specifically to account. If you're on a case and look up the customer can refer either an account or a contact entity. So the customer field is also available as a custom field. So you can add that to already existing system entities as well as your own custom entities too. So field names, the display names are used in a number of places. So keep that in mind when you create new names, because it's used in the column headings in the view. When you add the field to a form, that's the name that's going to be used. Any list, advanced find, form editor, wherever you're working with it, workflow steps, refer to this field under this name, the display name. You can change it, but keep in mind to keep it clear and concise if possible. The name is also used for the column in the database, so you can also refer to it by script. That is the schema name, and you cannot change that afterwards. So if you have a typo in there, too bad, you can't change it. There's some different settings for the field requirements that you can set. Optional basically means you can populate it or not. Business recommended means the exact same thing. You don't have to populate it, but it'll have a little blue dot next to the field to indicate that you should probably put some information in it, but it's not required. However, business required means that you have to populate this field in order to save the form. Otherwise, you cannot create new records unless that field is populated. And of course, that is only enforced on forms. If you import the records, for example, or they're generated another way, then you will probably be able to create records anyway without the business required field. And you can modify those with business rules or JavaScript. And of course, you can define whether or not fields can be searched, meaning they're available in the advanced find queries. There's another option too with the Interactive Service Hub that gives you a few more features. And you can also select here whether or not a field should be available in the global filter in the Interactive Service Hub dashboards, and whether or not you can sort by it in the Interactive Service Hub dashboards. So when you check that off, it basically means that when you click on the filter on the Interactive Service Hub dashboard, it lists a number of fields that you can filter the entire dashboard on. And that's where you specify what fields are available in order to do that. And of course, you can specify whether or not field security is included with this field, whether or not auditing the field should be audited. Keep in mind only audit relevant fields. That's also something that requires resources. And finally, there's a description that can be used to help yourself and other administrators, as well as the users, about what this field is for. Because when you hover your mouse over a field on a form, it will show this description. So you can basically guide the users a little bit by adding a good description. So as I mentioned, there's more to the field types than just the types of different data types. There's also some different display formats that you can work with for the single line of text type. And those are email, text area, URL, ticker symbol, and phone numbers. So basically means that this single line of text field can be enabled for email. So when you click on it, it'll open up an email. If it's for URL, you can click on it and it'll automatically take you to the website, like a company website, for example. The same with the phone number. You can click on it and it'll automatically launch a dial application. If that's Skype or Skype for Business, it'll automatically launch and it'll dial that specific number. Option sets and two option fields. Option sets is what allow you to basically define your own options. So when we have like an account type, you have VIP, preferred customer, standard customer. etc. You can have any number of values. Two option sets, you only have two options. It's either true or false, or 0 or 1. And you can configure for both of those, you can configure the default values. Option sets doesn't necessarily need to have a default value. Those can be empty by default. Two option set must have a default value, which is either true or false, or 0 or 1. One thing, option sets does always appear as a pick list. However, you can change the appearance of two option sets. So they, for example, instead of being a yes/no radio button, could on option drop-down list, it could also be a checkbox, for example. All right, and there's a question here. What's the basic difference between URL and ticker symbol, as both are pointing to a link access? So the ticker symbol is designed specifically to go to Microsoft's website for that ticker symbol, and not somebody else's website for it, whereas the URL will take you to whatever website is specified. All right, so numeric fields has some options as well. You can set minimum and maximum values on number fields. So if people put in a number that's too high or too low, or negative numbers or whatever it is that they're not supposed to, they'll get an error message. You also do have some precisions available for it. So not necessarily on whole number, because those are whole numbers, but for floating point, decimal, currencies, etc., you can set the decimal positioning as described here on floating point between 0 and 5 decimal, currencies between 0 and 4 decimal. Usually, for currencies, usually set to 2, and decimals can go all the way up to 10 decimals. So you have some flexibility there in how you can define those. All right. More formats. For whole number, you can basically have just store the number by itself, or you can set it as a duration. And duration basically means a number of minutes. So whatever number is in there is the number of minutes. 120 is 2 hours. What's different, though, is that you can set the selection when the user populates it. They can actually type in 2 hours. And that field, duration field, will automatically be set to 120. Or type in 2.5 hours, and it'll also have a little drop-down box so they can basically select from a list different duration options: 1 minute, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 1 day, etc. That they can work with. Time zone will let you pick a time zone, which is stored in there too. And you can also include a pick list from the different languages which are installed on your specific CRM organization. All right, currency. When you add a currency field, there's a couple of extra fields that are added. So in this case, if we add an extra field called price, and we say this is a currency field, you're not going to get just one field. You're actually going to get 4 fields added to your custom entity. And those fields are your prefix and price, which is the field that somebody would populate with the price of whatever this is. Then there's going to be price base, which is the value of the price entered in the base currency of the system. So if that's US dollars, that's going to be in US dollars. Then it's also going to add a currency field and an exchange rate, 2 additional fields. So if it's the currency is set to euro, and you type in 100 euros, and the exchange rate is 1.4, those 100 euros, the price base is going to be $140, for example. So you always have the price base field in there to be calculated based on the price that's inputted by the user in the price field according to the currency. So when it comes to currencies, as I mentioned earlier too, there's some precision options we talked a lot about. So you can use that precision in order to see how many decimals are actually needed. Usually the currency precision from the system I've seen is being set to 2, because that's usually how people use currencies. There are some comments here is that a 0 value for currencies could be a good option for fields that where you don't want to be too specific. So estimated revenue, for example, and you're working, is this going to be $200,000 or $225,000? It doesn't really matter if it's 224,551.56. Doesn't matter. So that could be an option to have zero decimals instead of multiple. However, I personally prefer keeping the same currency precision throughout the entire system. But that's just my preference. For date and time fields, there's some options there. And of course, it's always stored as date and time, regardless of what you select. However, they can be displayed differently. So they can be displayed as either date and time or just the date itself. All the information in the database is stored in the UTC time zone, so basically the Coordinated Universal Time Zone, and is being calculated. So the numbers that you see is basically set to the time zone that you have in your personal settings. The date only doesn't have any time zone conversion, but the time is actually stored in the database. So if you go look at the actual data, you'll also be able to see a time in there. And you can also set up a time zone independent field, so there won't be any time zone conversion on it, which means that date and time is stored and retrieved as specified. So if you have a call center and you're talking to people all over the globe, and you're looking up different stores and you're going to tell somebody their opening hours, you can use time zone independent fields on the account form for the stores to display the opening hours. If that's 8 to 5, you want to say 8 to 5 to the customer for the store for the time zone that they're in. You don't want to say 9 to 7, for example, because you're in a time zone that's 2 hours away. All right, lookup fields. Lookup fields does contain some information about the record that it's looking up. So a lookup field is basically a link or relationship to another entity. And what it stores is the GUID, or the unique identifier for the record. However, what it displays in the field is a primary field that we talked about earlier on the entity itself. So if you're looking at account and you're looking at a primary contact and see the name in there, that's the primary field for the contact. That's full name. And it's also always associated in the one-to-many relationship. And on forms, you can filter the lookup views based on other relationships. So like I talked about when we looked up primary contact on an account, it filters that view to only display contacts that are actually associated with that account. So those are only options when we want to populate primary contact. The same thing that I did on the editable grid earlier. All right, guys, only a few fields left. The customer field, as I mentioned earlier, that one is actually interesting in itself, is that unlike all other lookup fields that only refers to one entity, this one refers to either account or contact, and it stores the GUID for either of them. So, and of course, it displays the primary field name of whichever one that it's linked to. And you can specify that in your lookups. You can specify the different relationships. You can actually see that it's pointing to different fields. Keep in mind, if you want to use the customer field, make sure you think it through all the way. It looks great inside Dynamics 365 that it can go both ways to account or entity. All your charts and dashboards in Dynamics 365 will automatically adjust and use the names from the right place. But if, for example, if you're using Power BI and the customer field, you're going to have to do some manual changes to it and make sure that you have both the account and contact table and make sure that it picks the information from whichever one that it's referring to. All right, guys, we have a demonstration left, and then we have the review of the session. I know we're already 5 minutes over, but I hope you guys will bear with me for another about 5 minutes. All right, so let's go ahead and create a field. Let's see here. But what I'm going to show you first is that now my publish here has finally trickled through, and we can see that I now have an editable grid. So I can actually come in here and make changes directly in the names, directly in the grid. As I need to come in, do the lookup on the primary contacts. I can also change the grouping. So if I want to group by city, for example, I have all the different cities and basically group all my information in here. And all the information is still editable. I can still come in and make changes. All right, so that was just to wrap up on the previous demo there. It did take a few minutes, so I'm glad we didn't wait. So keep that in mind if you're trying to set it up. Don't be frustrated if it doesn't show immediately. Just make sure you publish, close your browser out, come back. All right, so I'll go to the custom entity and I'll go ahead and create a new field. And I select that here, create new attribute. And I come in and put in a display name. So say if I actually wanted to look up contacts from here, and this is where I set the field requirement, optional, business recommended, business required. Remember, there's only an action chain on business required. Business recommended is just a cosmetic change in the form where it gets a little blue icon. I can specify whether or not field security should be enabled, whether or not we want to audit this. The description here, this is the tooltip when hovering over this field on the form. And this is where I can make all the different selections, single line of text. And notice whenever I do make one of these selections, I have this field type, simple, calculated. If this was a number field, for example, I would also have the roll-up field as an option. Simple is just basically when it's for user input. Format, this is where I can select email, text area, URL, ticker symbol, and phone. I'll just leave this as text, maximum length. And I can also change option sets and use all the other types. I'll go ahead and select lookup and select contact. There you go. And now it's going to create a lookup field, and I'll just click Save and Close. It's going to create a contact lookup field on this entity. And actually what it's going to do too is also going to add, since I did not have the contact entity in this solution, it's going to add the contact entity to the solution because I created this relationship. All right, I'll go to Forms and go ahead and click on Information there, and I can now add this field to the main form. So I have the contact I added there. I can put it in. I can say Save and Close. And notice there, the contact there appeared right there, contact. And I'll just go ahead and publish this entity. So I'm just going to select the entity there specifically and click publish. Because then I publish just this entity. I'm not publishing all of them. So that may save us a little bit of time, even though there's only 3 different items in there, 3 different entities, and not a whole lot of components. All right. There's sales. Notice I have the custom entity. Notice it's also in the same color there, so we'll select it. So I'll go to custom entities and create a new one. There you go, new custom entity. I can put in a name. I can hover over the contact there, and you can see this is the tooltip. Go ahead and select a random contact, demo, save and close. There we go. All right, a quick review, and then we are done for the day. One note though, there is a PDF document with some questions about this session and the next session that you guys can download from the content in this meeting, or this Skype session. So you can go do that and you can practice for the questions. We'll go through those polls and questions on the next sessions, but you can go through them now if you want to. So just a quick review here. We looked at using solutions to create, package, deploy, and maintain all your customizations. We looked very specifically at how solutions only contain references and not copies of each component. So keep that in mind. The process, a lifecycle of solution that start out as unmanaged and don't become managed unless you specify that during the solution export. And of course, all importing a solution will fail unless you have all the required components either in the solution itself or present in the target environment. And finally, by creating new custom entities, of course, that's where you really start creating your Dynamics 365 environment and meeting all the functionality or meet all the requirements that doesn't come out of the box. And of course, each of those entities that you create, you can configure for additional functionality, additional fields, and of course also manage the properties and define what you will allow others to change later as needed. And of course, some of those things that you can add to entities are additional custom fields and different types of fields, so you can capture all the relevant data. All right, guys, we went about 15 minutes over. I'm sorry about that. I'll try to stick on time, but sometimes that's just a lot of content, and I like to get it all covered. But the next session, we'll have a few more things on field customizations and how we work with fields, and we'll also be talking about the different types of relationships that we can build in the system. So I'm looking forward to doing that, and thank you very much, everybody, for attending here this morning or evening, depending on what time it is. And